Skyhawk Continued by Jill Lewis. Chapter 6. "You did a good job with those lambs yesterday," said Dad. "Maybe we'll make a farmer of you yet." I sat in the back of the car behind Mum and Dad on the way to church. "Do I have to go to church?" I said. "Graham doesn't." "Well, he's 18, Mum said. It's up to him." "Rob doesn't go, or Ewan." Mum spun round to me with a look on her face. "For goodness sake, Callum, will you stop your whinging? It's only about an hour. It's not going to kill you." I could see the corner of Dad's eyes crinkle in the mirror. He was laughing at me. I slumped down and shoved my knees in the back of his seat. "Have you got any plans today?" said Dad. "Playing football," I said, "with Rob and Ewan and others from school." It was true. We said we'd meet on Sunday afternoon and kick a ball about in the playing field, but I kept thinking of Iona and watching an osprey return. I wanted to go back up the lock. I'd have to tell Rob and Ewan I was helping Dad on the farm instead. "Just make sure you're back for tea," said Mum. Iona was already standing on the cairn when I reached the top of the hill. I flopped down in the heather to get my breath back. The sky was cloudless, the lock was flat, like a mirror, reflecting the blue sky. I focused my binoculars on the eyrie in the pine tree. The osprey was pulling more sticks into place. "Here," I said, "do you want to look?" Iona put the binoculars to her eyes, and I showed her how to focus them. "It's brilliant," she said. "He looks so close. And look at his beak. It's vicious, that beak. Look how sharp it is." I let Iona use the binoculars, and I looked south. Aeroplane trails crisscrossed the sky, and a flock of geese flew in a V-shape in the far distance. But otherwise, the horizon was empty. I leaned back into the soft heather, out of the cold tug of the wind. The sun was warm on my face, and I felt my eyelids close. I woke feeling chilled and cold. Iona was still sitting on the cairn, looking at the sky. Shadows had crept across the glen below, and I looked at my watch. "We've been up here for 2 hours now," I said to Iona. "There's no osprey coming." She gave me a hard stare. "She'll be here soon enough. Just you wait and see." I stripped the end of a sprig of heather and watched the small pieces scatter in the breeze. I flicked the bare stem at her. I knew I should have played football instead. It would have been loads more fun. Iona turned her back on me. "You didn't have to come." "I'm missing a good game," I continued. "She'll come from over there," said Iona. She pointed across the bright waters of the loch to the heather hills and the smudge of purple mountains beyond. "How do you know?" I said. She stood up and stretched her arms wide, like outspread wide. They were like wings. "I just know. I can feel it. You have to imagine you're a bird to feel it." "I'm not flapping my arms and running about the hills if that's what you think." Iona shrugged her shoulders. The wind lifted the tangled ends of her hair. "Flap around all you like," I said. "I'm off." I shook the bits of heather from my jumper and set off down the hill, kicking hummocks of dry grass. I turned to look at her, but she just stood, arms wide, her eyes closed. The wind rippled across her coat and jeans. It did look as if she was soaring against the clear blue sky. "You really think she's coming?" I said. "I know so." "You should really try this, Callum." I scowled at her. "No one can see you up here," she said, lifting her arms higher. "Just as well then," I said, and I stretched my arms and turned to the wind. I wanted to believe Iona. I wanted to see an osprey come back. "You've got to close your eyes," Iona called. "Become bird. Feel the wind, Callum. Let it carry you." I closed my eyes and tried to forget I was standing on a hillside like some stupid scarecrow. All I could hear was the soft hiss of wind rushing through the dry heather. It flowed over me, tugging at the sleeves of my jumper. I leaned into it, letting it run through the tips of my fingers. I stretched them wide, like feathers. I really tried to imagine that I was a bird. Weightless. being carried up, up into the bright blue sky, up above the mountains, up into the fast winds, up into the splintered rays of sun. "I can see her!" cried Iona. I opened my eyes and squinted into the sunlight. There was a silhouette of a bird in the distance, like the shape small children drew when they drew seagulls. But it wasn't a seagull. It was bigger than that, much bigger. The bird flew closer and banked in the air, showing the white of its belly and the wings and tail feathers below. I looked through the binoculars. "It's definitely an osprey," I said. "Of course it is," said Iona. "Come on, let's get a closer look." We ran down the hillside towards the wooden shores of the loch. Iona was already darting through the trees ahead of me. When I pulled myself up into the oak tree, Iona was sitting on the wooden crates, her eyes shining. "Look, he's spotted her," she said. There was so much excitement in her eyes. I looked across at the eyrie. The male was perched on the top, his wings held slightly open, showing the white underneath. He suddenly lifted up into the sky, carrying a fish. Up he flew, higher and higher. We could hear his high-pitched cry, "Kee, kee, kee!" Then he swooped and dived, plummeting downwards, the fish held in his talons. He was a blur against the wooded hillside, faster and faster towards the water, until he pulled out of his dive and flew high in the air once more. The female soared in circles above, just watching him. "He's sky dancing," said Iona with a grin. "He's trying to impress her." The male did his spectacular high dive trick again, but this time pulled up from his dive and flew to the eyrie with the fish. We watched the female circle lower and lower until she landed on the tree next to him. She clung onto a branch as it swayed beneath her, inspecting the eyrie. I held my breath. But suddenly she flapped her wings and flew off over the trees behind us, and with that she was gone. "She's not impressed," I said. I focused my binoculars on the male osprey. I almost laughed. If a bird could look totally let down, then this was how it would look. The feathers on his head were all ruffled, and he kept looking at his fish, as if it was all the fish's fault. "Here she comes again," whispered Iona. The female swooped in low and wide and landed right on the eyrie. She paced around the edge and pulled a few sticks into place as though it wasn't quite to her liking. Then she pulled the fish away from the male and started tearing off chunks of flesh. Iona leaned into me and nudged me. "Look, she likes him." I nodded, and for some reason felt my face burn bright red. Chapter 7. I sprinkled brown sugar onto my porridge and watched it melt into sticky golden pools. "That'll rot your teeth," said Dad. He sprinkled salt and a small lump of butter on his own porridge and swirled it around. He looked tired and grumpy. I guess he'd been up all night, checking on the ewes that were due to lamb. "You were late coming back from football yesterday," said Dad. He flicked through a farming magazine beside him. "Graham and I could have done with some help." I wanted to tell them I was up on the hills watching an osprey come back. I was bursting to tell them we had ospreys nesting here on our farm. Lost page. I was bursting to tell them. But it was a secret. Iona's and my secret. We'd promised to tell no one. Graham poured a cup of tea and laughed. "He wasn't playing football yesterday. He was up on the hill, flapping around like a wee birdie. I saw him with a girl up there." He turned to me. "Is she your girlfriend, is she?" I hit him on the arm, and tea spilled across the table. "Ouch! Grow up, you two, for heaven's sake," said Mum. "Graham, you're old enough to know better." She mopped the tea from the table and sat back in the rocker chair, warming her feet on the cooker range. "Which girl's this?" Graham raised his eyebrows. It looked like mad old McNair's granddaughter to me. "I heard she was back," said Mum. "Fiona McNair's child," said Dad. He turned to Mum. "You were at school with Fiona, weren't you?" Mum nodded. "Aye, but that was a while ago. There's a lot of water gone under the bridge since then." "Rob hates the McNairs," I said. "He says Iona's mum stole from his dad and ruined his business. Is it true?" Mum started cleaning the table. "It's true that a lot of money went missing the day Fiona left," she sighed. "But truth be told, Rob's dad was never much of a businessman anyway. He was trying to build an adventure park, said Dad. Bike trails through the forest and high wire stuff in the trees. It was losing money before Fiona worked there. She's a dancer, isn't she? I said. That's what Iona says. She's in the big shows down in London. Mum and Dad exchanged glances, and Dad went back to reading his magazine. Well, I haven't heard from her for a while, said Mum. But I heard she did a bit of dancing. Graham gave a snort of laughter. Dad glared at him. Haven't you got sheep to feed? Graham reached for his coat and gave me a slap on the back. Off to school now, he grinned. Don't be late. It wasn't fair. Graham was 18. He'd finished school and was back on the farm where he'd always wanted to be. Mum and Dad even let him live in the cottage up the track which had been Grandad's before he died. Graham said he needed his own space. I didn't think Mum should cook his meals and wash all his clothes too if he was going to have his own space. What's she like? Asked Mum. Who, Iona? I said. I shrugged my shoulders. How should I know? I whizzed into school as the bell rang. It was Monday morning and I was late. I pushed my bike into the rack next to Rob's and raced to the classroom. The rest of the class were already in their seats. The teacher gave me a hard stare and tapped her watch as I sat down next to Rob and Ewan. What happened to you on Friday? Whispered Ewan. You didn't get home for hours after we left you. Mum made me tell her where we'd been. It seemed ages ago, although it was only 3 days. I was checking on sheep, I lied. You'll never guess who's in our class, said Rob. His face was dark like thunder. He nodded to the tables at the front of the class. It's her. At that moment, Iona turned round. It was as if she could feel us looking at her. She looked strangely out of place in the classroom, in her grey uniform and blue fleece. Her hair was tied in a ponytail, but thick clumps and tangles stuck out at the back. She smiled at me, but I looked away. Nutter, said Rob. Our teacher introduced Iona, but most of the class knew of her. At least they knew her grandad, and that was enough to get some of the girls giggling. At lunch break, I saw Iona by herself, alone. She sat on the far wall of the playground, staring out over the fields. I joined a group from my class, trading cards, and pretended I hadn't seen her. She forgot her lunch, said Ruth. She won't tell the teachers, though. Look at the state of her, said Sarah. I don't see why she should be allowed to wear trainers when no one else can. Ruth spread her cards out on the table. I heard Amar's locked up in a mental home. Sarah picked a card and swapped it for one of hers. Mum said to have nothing to do with her. Why? I asked. 'Cause she's a nutter, said Rob. You've seen that yourself. I saved a sandwich for Iona, but didn't get a chance to give it to her until afternoon class. The teacher let Iona pick someone to work with in the library for our class project on recycling, and she picked me. Thanks, said Iona. She wolfed the sandwich down and wiped the crumbs from her chin. We sat in the corner of the library and spread out books in front of us. No one else was in there. The sun poured through the big side windows. Look at this book, said Iona. She sat down next to me and opened a large book on Scottish wildlife and started flicking through the pages. She had so much excitement. You've got a pine marten down on your farm, did you know? I leaned across to look at the picture of the creature sitting in the branch of a tree. Its long brown body looked part hart, part weasel. I'd only caught a glimpse of a pine marten once before, just as its face was peering above an old fallen trunk. It had turned and disappeared into the undergrowth, showing a last view of its bushy tail. I flicked over to another page. Iona seemed to know more about my farm than I did. I've seen golden eagles before, I said, trying to impress her. Really? Said Iona. I've never seen one of them. Last year I saw them. On the other side of the hill, I said. We can go and look for them. I'd like that, Iona smiled. I leaned across Iona to point to a photo of a red deer. And we've got those. Callum! I jumped. I hadn't heard the library door open. Rob was standing behind us, staring at me. I leapt to my feet. Time to pack up, said Rob. He scowled at Iona. Iona went back to flicking through her book. I ignored her and started putting books away on the shelves. Come on, said Rob. It's home time. Let her do the rest. I followed Rob out through the door and into the playground. We pulled our bikes from the rack and pushed them out past the mums and dads waiting at the school gates. Mad old McNair was standing on the other side of the road. a stooped figure in a long brown coat. As we cycled past, I noticed striped pyjamas flap against his bare legs. "Horatio," said Rob. I pedalled like mad behind Rob up the hill and out of the village. When we got to the top of the hill, I glanced back down the road. The village lay sprawled out like a map beneath us, the bright green of the playing field dotted with a few sheep, the village hall and the shop and the stone cottages. The school playground had emptied, and cars were winding their way along the narrow roads. A stooped figure shuffled slowly along the south road out of the village. A smaller figure behind him turned to look up and waved. "Come on," said Rob. "What are you waiting for?" I didn't wave back. Instead, I turned my bike down the steep descent of Shepherd's Lane, my wheels following in Rob's tyre tracks all the way. So we spent a bit of time in class thinking about the relationships that Callum has with Rob, Ewan and Iona, and how they change as we go through the different chapters. So if you are tuning in, feel free to have a think about that.